So in last week's fun rant, I completely forgot to actually explain what I believe is the logic of why people choose to do remakes in the first place. Let's not forget there have been a lot of good remakes. The Thing from 1982 is a remake of The Thing from Another World from the 1950s, and some people prefer one or the other. It's a very valid comparison. Personally, I prefer the remake because it takes the seriousness of the danger a little more closely to the original source material than the 1950s version. But that's just my opinion. Don't tell Cinemassacre, they'll be very upset. There's also great stories of video game remakes, like, say, the Resident Evil remake is considered one of the best remakes of all time, and I almost cannot imagine anyone thinking that it's not the superior product. So why do we choose to put our own mark over someone else's past work? I can only speak for myself. I knew I wanted to be a storyteller when, shortly after both reading the first two Harry Potter books and viewing Star Wars Episode 1, I had a vision in my head of a very different story about a school for magic, a secret world of wizards, and a dark lord. And I do mean very different. Yes, it was still a school for magic. Yes, that would still be the focus. Yes, there would be a character whose sole purpose in the story would be to one day defeat the Dark Lord. But it wasn't focused on the charm that J.K. Rowling very well made when she did Harry Potter. And the bad guy wasn't this weird amorphous, he's just bad because he's bad kind of guy. Though we didn't know that would be the case at the time. The story I came up with began with the main character discovering the Dark Lord in a dark dungeon in his school, using magic to mentally convert students to his cause. These days would be considered the corruption archetype. And then from there, the story would go on, and eventually there would be a climactic battle where the main character would die and his best friend would be the one to finally kill the Dark Lord. That would be many books later, if I'd ever gotten around to it. And of course, because I was me, when the wizards fought, they turned their wands into literal lightsabers. Because, well, 9-year-old logic, am I right? When I was in middle school, I wrote my own version of Resident Evil. I was introduced to the series via seeing the action figures at KB Toys in Brooklyn. At the time, I thought that the logo was President Evil. Again, don't ask me why. I was a 9-year-old. I watched a friend of mine play the opening minutes of the third game, and then the first film came out. And the trailers caught my attention, probably because I had mistaken the name. And that's where it actually gets really interesting. So, if you remember the logos for Resident Evils 1 and 2 and 3, and then replace the title with President Evil, and then imagine the action figures that existed for them, you can imagine a completely different story. There's demons, there's possession, there's manipulation of the masses, I guess. It's an interesting idea. There's a mood, a tone to that kind of story. But that mood probably is what initially pulled me to the brand. And you can immediately understand that that's ridiculous because that mood has nothing to do with those games or those movies. And I think that mistake pulled me to that world from there on. Because when I did discover the actual tone of the games, both through my viewing of the third game at my friend's house, and through my discovery of the actual original games as they were coming out, and I was looking for ways to appreciate the story without actually paying to rent the film, my appreciation transformed. As I mentioned in the main video, to me, Resident Evil has gone beyond just a brand, per se. Because of the aesthetics of those and plot choices of those first three games, I would call Resident Evil an archetype or a sub-archetype, if you will. To me, it's clear that it was called Umbrella Corporation, say, because it was the literal metaphor of using an umbrella company to hide one business inside another, or a series of businesses inside another. There was something about how they showed Raccoon City, despite the fact that it had honestly very little to do with how actual cities look in America, that rang true to, I don't know what you would call it, but that specific tone from the turn of this century. It's not cyberpunk, it's not diesel punk, it's not nuke punk. It's in between all of them. And I don't know, maybe it's because I grew up in that time, I felt tied to it. But that was when more realistic tone was all the rage. If anyone remembers, though it'd be hard now, the way that the original X-Men films tried to distance themselves from the camp of their comic roots, how Batman Begins took a pretty realistic tone, again, for the source material, tried to find a real excuse why you would have that kind of vigilante, and other hyper-realistic remakes of old films and retellings of old stories. It was the mood for that time. And it did start before 9/11, but 9/11 just extended it for a few more years because that 90s optimism was most definitely well and truly beaten over the head with a spiked baseball bat after that happened. So naturally, the campy tone of Resident Evil clashed with the current cultural milieu. But because I was tied to the idea of Resident Evil, I wanted to turn it into something that matched what I was feeling tonally at the time. And also I have a general problem, personally, where I always need a little bit more logos in my stories than the really good ones provide. I've noticed that a lot of the really, really great art that I love is just slightly more on the pathos side than the logo side for my tastes. And additionally, I have had repeatedly the experience of seeing advertising that, again, promised me a tone, whether intentionally or not, that didn't really match what the end product gave. Great example is I didn't give Atlantis Lost Empire its due credit because when I first saw the teaser, I expected a very different tone than what it actually was. Same with Rotel Dorado, although my understanding is most people fell into that trap. The same thing for live action films. If anyone remembers the original teaser trailer for Michael Bay's The Island, it hinted at something much more than what we actually got. The movie, as I recall, wasn't terrible, but again, I was sold on a tone, and that tone was never delivered. And so, when it came to Resident Evil, initially I took issue with a few of the mostly plot points with the film. And so I started reworking it for myself, for my own tastes. And from there, it kept expanding and changing and incorporating more of the game stories. And then seeing Black Hawk Down, being a 13-year-old, I thought, oh, this is realistic army things. I'm going to put this in here. And if anyone remembers from the last video, this hand-drawn poster for something called Dead October, and then a book cover for the same story. That was the result of that journey. As I mentioned in the main video, there's definitely this pattern where something inspires, I guess, a refresh like this, and then eventually, if you let that idea continue, and the environment doesn't validate every little rebrush you have of someone else's work, eventually what you do will transform into its own unique thing, which more or less happened with Dead October. And eventually I did get it published as a print-on-demand book. My very first video on this channel was, in fact, a trailer I put together for it, hoping to bump sales up. Came out when I was in high school. Don't go get it, it's terrible. And so, there's a part of me that thinks that maybe all these people that try to develop their own versions and variants of things, there's nothing wrong with it intrinsically. It's, it's what leads to new IPs in a way, which is kind of what I was trying to lead to with my main video. But, it feels like maybe with how easy it is to create renderings of what you like and to make fan films these days, and all the power we get from personal computing, that pressure to push past the indulgent cover and move on to a unique creation of your own has been limited. But beyond that, I know I feel a deep desire very often to bring that original feeling I had about what something would be to life. You'll find people who believe that the 1970s variant of Invasion of the Body Snatchers is the best. You'll find some that believe the original is the best. I don't know if you'll find anyone who, God help them, thinks the 90s one is the best. You're not liable to find anyone who prefers the 2000s version, though for me that is personally my favorite. I know, bring the torches and pitchforks. But each of those is a unique take. They really are. They're the same idea, but a completely different story. Those remind me most of the best video game sequels, where instead of trying to continue the same story, it's more of an iteration on the game mechanics. It used to be a lot easier to justify game sequels that way, but now in a world where there's a million different video game IPs, it's hard to pin yourself down on, I'm iterating on my same mechanics again, instead of continuing the story. But anyway, see, the biggest issue audience members have, and I know this from talking to friends of mine who don't really get as deep in the weeds on this sort of thing as I do. They just look at entertainment for entertainment value. They don't insist it be as deep and complex, quote-unquote TM, as I do. And when even they dislike the sequel or the remake, you know that there is something uniquely wrong there. It's not just a patrician versus plebeian type thing. And it's been happening more and more. And I've obviously enjoyed partaking in viewing the, post-skeptic critic space, where, people defend sometimes even the Star Wars prequels in the face of the Disney trilogy and what they've done to the series. And it feels like that disrespect for why people enjoy the original is that line. When you decide that you're going to not just take a different, more contemporary tone with the old material, but you're going to be dismissive and actively aggressive against the previous fans, that's when you're going to alienate everybody. And so that's where I find myself in a trap. For some reason, Resident Evil is the brand that I always come back to almost yearly to try and, quote-unquote, fix, right? Does anyone remember the disappointment when the Resident Evil 3 remake came out, and people came out all these things about, if only they had done this, if only they had done that, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, I was one of them. Resident Evil 3 was my favorite of the first 3 games. Maybe it is because it was the first one I had any experience with, but as I said in the last video, the city as a character, that's actually really what ties me to that series as a whole. More than anything else is the idea of creating a fictional city and having it have a feel, a character to it, and what happens to it when this disaster occurs. So anyway, I've always tried to work through how to make myself happy with the Resident Evil setup and the city. And, if you're listening to this rant, you'll think, okay, so just create your own city. You've already done that once with your book, sounds like, right? Okay, create your own city. Have a zombie outbreak happen because of... Sure, let's have a corporation virus. Why not? I mean, there's so many of those at this point. No one's going to attack you for doing that as your premise, especially if you're not going to make it campy like the games. Then they really have no leg to stand on. Just, file off the serial numbers on the characters and the corporations, and you're good. But Resident Evil is, like I said, it's an archetype. Like the name and logo for Umbrella. There's just they're trying to bring it back in the games, even though they've been moving away from that stuff interminably since Code Veronica. But it still keeps pulling them back in because that's core to Resident Evil. Like, I still haven't bought Resident Evil 7 or 8. And I probably won't because I'm sure they're great games. But they don't have those visual elements that, to me, are Resident Evil. And they're not just visual, that's the thing, right? Is Umbrella Corporation, yeah, it's, as it went on, the story with it got dumber and dumber, but the idea of what it is, it's like Weyland-Yutani, right? You're not going to make an Alien movie without Weyland-Yutani. I mean, and maybe Alien's not the best example because there's just the name, but there's also visual characteristics that are completely inseparable from Umbrella Corporation with that logo. But that's neither here nor there. And that's what makes it difficult with Resident Evil is, that's one of those things that I feel like I need to remake, but I don't know if I can because what I want from that series is very different from what the old school fans want. Old school fans enjoy the camp. And I don't blame them, right? There's a lot of moments that you would want to put in a remake because they feel right. The pathos that they provided in the original version, even I can admit that they make me feel tied to the story. But they don't make logical sense. So they have to be either reorganized or removed, and do I have the right to claim I'm remaking it when I'm taking those things away from the fans, right? From what I would consider the true fans, because I came in pretty late, to really be a committed fan only after the first film came out. That's not being a real Resident Evil fan. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying I like the movies and I hate the games or, think the games are dumber than the movies or any of that nonsense. I'm not a normie about it. I appreciate the camp. But there's always that splinter in my mind telling me it could be better told my way. And that's the thing, right? I think it was pretty clear in my last video that I think that there's a mediocrity problem we're experiencing right now honestly as a planet. And I'm part of it, right? I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I am one of those old geniuses that, brought art to its peak in the last century. And now with the internet, anyone mediocre but passionate enough can put together a freaking Cal Arts rebrush of a classic character, right? I mean, the joke is that's the purpose of the Cal Arts style, right? To make it cheap enough that you can hire someone for dirt cheap to make your crappy reboot. I guess the only way I can really figure out, whether what I've got in mind is different than those terrible re-wear her organs people is to just, in theory, put it out and see what people think of it. And if people like it, then I'm not one of them, and if they don't, then oh well, I guess. Then it only has value to me. But what do you think? One day I really will do a full, non-ramble video about why I think Resident Evil is an archetype, what I think it should be. Do you think maybe that I'm way overthinking this issue? I also think that we should take a moment this weekend to take a look behind for those that can no longer follow. If you're in America, spare a backward glance for your fellow citizens who gave the ultimate sacrifice, and give one more smile and laugh when you do the things that they can no longer. I know it's a crazy time, but remember that we are all one people, and that some gave all for that vision. And I do mean that. I do believe that America is that white city on the hill, and she is worth defending. Anyways, Tommy, do you think I'm crazy? Do you think Resident Evil is just a corporate product and doesn't deserve this level of obsession. Do you not think it's an archetype of the zombie outbreak genre? Do you think that we don't have a mediocrity problem? Do you think doing a remake every time the social milieu changes is a good idea? Or do you think they should never be a remake and that we should always just appreciate all artifacts as a moment of their time? Or maybe perhaps just an in-between where you agree that there's an idea that should be reinterpreted as it grabs every new generation, while other things can just be left as a timely moment, never to be repeated again, but to always be seen in its moment. Have a good day. You and yours observe the holiday. If you do, how you do. Share this with your battle buddies. And have a good day.